Welcome to the Law Firm Practice Management Advice Podcast.
The fundamentals of business.
Join Kirk Stange of Stange Law Firm as he discusses helpful strategies, tools, and insights to grow and manage a legal practice.
Good ideas are simple.
From improving client relationships to managing your team and scaling your practice, this podcast offers practical advice for navigating the challenges of law firm management.
Shall we proceed?
Now, here's your host, Kirk Stange.
Welcome to Law Firm Practice Management Advice. We have an interesting topic today. The topic is parameters for attorney salaries. In this episode today is based on an article on my blog, lawfirmpracticemanagementadvice.com, dated November 19th, 2025. And the title of that article is How Much to Pay an Associate Attorney. So as a follow-up to the episode today, going over to my blog and read this article for more information, but let's go ahead and jump on into the topic at hand today. And the issue is, how much should a law firm pay an associate attorney? And this is really an age-old question that lots of law firm owners have to consider and think about. And for a lot of law firms, this can be a difficult decision, and they can struggle to come up with a workable formula that works within their budget. But really, in a nutshell, what a lot of law firms do is gravitate to one or two extremes, okay? Extreme number one is a law firm overpays associates in order to get them to work for their firm. So the idea is we're going to offer a very high salary, and by offering a very high salary, we will get top talent, and we'll have an easy time getting people to work for our law firm. This strategy obviously sounds good on the front end. Who wouldn't want top talent? But the problem is for a lot of law firms, if they do this, they can get themselves into financial trouble. In other words, they can become overextended. So if they're paying large salaries and their revenues don't really give the ability for the law firm to pay those salaries, and what a lot of law firms can end up with is a situation where they're overextended and they've got financial troubles. And when that occurs, then what a lot of law firms end up having to do is let some of these employees go. So they spend a bunch of time recruiting these, quote, top employees, but they can't afford to keep them. And once that train sort of begins, law firms can shrink, and I hate to say it, ultimately have problems. They might implode and might not exist anymore. So overpaying associates is something that is tempting, but law firms should be careful there. All right? On the other end of the spectrum, and I'd say this is probably a lot less common, but law firms don't offer enough salary. So they do the exact opposite. They get nervous, they get conservative. They don't want to get overextended. They don't want to have financial trouble, so they offer salaries that just aren't high enough in order to get any top talent to come work for them, right? So their salary is too low. And obviously, if the salary is too low, then you're not going to get anybody to work for you, okay? So what is the proper way in which to pay associates? That's the question here today. And obviously, in a general sense, I should say every law firm's different. Different practice areas of the law can be very different in terms of how associate attorneys are paid. Okay, so there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but having said that, there is this sort of age-old way in which law firms have historically paid attorneys, and it's something I think a lot of law firms ought to know, they ought to think about, and they ought to at least consider. To me, it's sort of remarkable, but a lot of people who go down the path of hiring associates aren't even familiar with this rule, okay? And this rule is called the old rule of thirds for paying lawyers. And if you look it up, this has been around for more than 100 years, okay? So the way the rule of thirds work is you take the revenue that an attorney generates, and 1/3 goes to the lawyer in terms of base salary, 1/3 goes to the overhead, okay? Overhead could be the office rent, could be the office supplies, could be the malpractice insurance, it could be the workers' compensation insurance, the general liability insurance, okay? Law firms have CLE dues that they have to pay for their lawyers. There could be bar dues, right? I mean, overhead is just on and on and on, and it's really endless. It could be the marketing that a lot of law firms have to engage in order to get the business, okay? And then another 1/3 goes to the law firm as the law firm's profit. In other words, the law firm's taking a risk on hiring this attorney, so the partners in the firm typically profit in some manner on the salary being brought in by the lawyer, okay? So to take the rule of thirds and break it down into a tangible example, let's say a lawyer brings in $300,000 in actual revenue. Under the rule of thirds, the argument would be $100,000 goes to the lawyer, $100,000 goes to the overhead, and then $100,000 goes to the law firm itself. Okay, so this is the rule of thirds: a third, a third, a third. It's been around for hundreds of years. Okay, and so one of the first questions a lot of law firms have to think about when they're hiring associates is the lawyer generating 3 times what they're getting paid? And under the rule of thirds, if they are, then the law firm's probably in pretty good shape. But if the law firm's paying the lawyer more than a third of what they bring in, then under the rule of thirds, it probably isn't a good financial decision, okay? But even taking this a little bit further, this analysis can be complicated. Okay, it could be complicated in this day and age by marketing. A lot of law firms spend a lot of money to market, whether this be radio, television, billboards, through having a web page, through doing online advertising, through, let's say, Google or social media, or you name it. There's all kinds of online advertising options. And so when you get into this, the overhead can be tremendous, particularly the overhead in terms of what it costs to bring in the clients, okay? It's not a day and age where when the third rule came down, where most business was coming in through word of mouth. In this day and age, I mean, a lot of law firms, the marketing is what drives the cases coming into the firm. And of course, if the lawyer is not the one paying the marketing, it's the firm, right? Then the third formula can be much more complex, okay? Other things that can make the third formula more complex in this day and age is rising cost. I mean, inflation is a thing. And one of the big costs law firms have, which is just going up exponentially, is health insurance cost. Health insurance is very expensive. So if the law firm is covering that health insurance, okay, you get into this issue when you're talking a third. Part of that third to the lawyer is the health insurance cost, right? A lot of lawyers would want the health insurance cost to be on top of their third. So pay me the third plus you pay the health insurance, okay? And maybe some law firms do that, but a lot of folks could argue with a third formula that if the attorney's bringing in $100,000 or $300,000 and they're getting $100,000, if they're $100,000, they should be covering their health insurance cost, okay? So that gets tricky here, okay? Another thing that gets tricky is collection rates, okay? A lawyer theoretically could bill $300,000 worth of time, but the question is, how much do they collect? Okay, if they only collect 2/3 of that, so they collect $200,000 of the $300,000, then they wouldn't get $100,000. Instead, they get 1/3 of the $200,000, which would be $66,666.66. Okay, so a lot of lawyers might not like that, but it's not what a lawyer bills. It's what it collects, okay? And a lot of lawyers aren't collecting everything that they bill. There's an article, and I've got a link to it in my article, where a lawyer argues a third is not the proper formula anymore. What this author writes is that it's really 20% to the lawyer, right? 20% to the lawyer of what they generate, and it's 20% based on challenging economic conditions and then rising benefit costs, which I've already talked about. Take that health insurance going up astronomically. Other insurances that can be very expensive. Practice insurance isn't cheap. A law firm's got to have general liability, workers' compensation insurance, employment practices insurance, crime and cyber insurance, right? Law firms do 401k matches, let's say, these kinds of things. That costs a lot of money. Maybe they have a disability policy. So the argument of this writer is 20% is what a lawyer should get. All right, so no matter kind of how you shake this down, whether it's the third rule or the 20% rule, this is generally where attorney salaries, if you're looking at the numbers from a financial sense, should be. So lawyer gets about 20 to 33% of what they bring in base salary. Okay. Obviously, again, if a law firm wants to pay more than that in order to attract top talent. They certainly can, but the issue is going to be, do they put themselves in financial trouble if they do it? Okay, some law firms might give associates 50% of what they bring in, but then the problem is can that law firm sustain under that kind of formula? Okay, and so 20 to 33% is kind of the guidance that's out there in terms of what a lawyer's base salary ought to be. Okay, you can look this up, and I got a link in my article to another webpage where a law firm owner complains, saying that, look, I got a billable hour requirement of 1,200 hours for my associate attorneys. None of them are making 1,200 hours, and I'm paying them more than $100,000, and I'm hurting financially. And I thought that was an interesting link, and it really speaks to the fact that, yes, when law firms pay more than the 20 to 33%, it can hurt, particularly if the lawyers aren't bringing in the revenue they're supposed to bring in. So to the average associate attorney, they're often thinking, the lawyers who own the firm are making a ton of money. But the practical reality is that a lot of law firm owners aren't. In fact, they're kind of losing money because they've got billable hour requirements of certain numbers. Lawyers aren't meeting it. And then they're paying lawyers more than 20 to 33% in base salary of what they bring in, and then law firms begin to hurt in this scenario. And again, this is where law firm owners then get tempted to cut employees out, shed employees if they're not producing. So it's much better for most law firms to pay a reasonable sum that's affordable to them, and it makes it worth their while in order to have these associates work for them. Okay, so 20 to 33% of what a lawyer brings in is kind of the norm in terms of what lawyers ought to make in a general sense. Again, different practice areas might be different, but in a general sense, this is kind of the guidance that's out there. Okay, another question a lot of law firm owners have is, well, what about incentives on top of base salary? In other words, if I'm just paying 20 to 33% in base salary to associates in terms of what they bring in, a lot of these associates aren't going to be real happy with that, and they won't have an incentive to work harder. So should we put in some sort of bonus systems or incentives in order to give attorneys, if you will, the desire to want to work hard? And so, incentives can make a lot of sense. And obviously incentives can work in many different ways, okay? A law firm could pay a discretionary bonus to an associate lawyer who beats their billable hours and accounts receivable goals. So you could just have a flat number. If you meet your numbers, here's what I'm going to give you. Obviously, the downside of this, if somebody exactly makes their hours and then somebody else exceeds it by 100 hours, they're both getting paid the same bonus. So you could argue maybe that's not the best. But if you have a flat bonus system, if they meet the goals, then it's a lot easier. The law firm doesn't have to have a calculator out and trying to compute some complicated formula, if you will. Okay, another type of incentive that can be useful is to pay lawyers a discretionary bonus if they bring in referrals into the firm, So they bring in cases, it's outside of the firm's marketing efforts, and they get a cut out of that case. Again, you could do a complicated formula, or you could just do a set amount that they get. I think that can be useful. The third scenario, I just kind of alluded to it, but you could come up with a formula-driven bonus system where you put in the actual revenue they generated, and then you back out the exact numbers in terms of their expenses, and then you can see the exact profitability that's there, and then you could divide that with the associate. In some ways, maybe that's the most fair system, because it's based on real profits. On the other hand, if you get into complicated formulas, people can begin to argue it. It can be complicated. This can lead to disputes. So maybe a flat system is easier, but the more complicated system might be more equitable in a way. I'd say the smaller the firm, the easier it is to do kind of a complicated bonus system. The larger the firm, it's just be a headache trying to compute it, okay? So bonus systems can make a whole lot of sense. But look, truth be told, most associates, this is my experience, aren't very impressed by incentive-based pay. Most are just looking for guaranteed money, and they'll jump ship if another law firm offers them more guaranteed money than what you're willing to pay them, okay? And even if the competitor, they're they're not paying within the 20 to 33% rule. Maybe they're being really aggressive, like some of those firms I talked about at the beginning, and they're paying 50% to the lawyer or something like that. Look, a lot of lawyers will jump ship and go to those firms. And, the question is going to be, will they be able to sustain at that job? In other words, will the law firm be able to pay that salary in the long term? I'd say in a lot of scenarios, these other law firms will figure out that salary is a hard one to swallow based on the revenue being brought in by the attorney. But look, a lot of lawyers are going to jump for the higher guaranteed salary. I think it makes sense for a lot of lawyers. Obviously, if they have a lot of student loan debt, they have a family, or they're trying to have a family with rising prices, lawyers are going to try to get as much money as they can. I understand that and recognize that, and I think any law firm owner who's been doing this long enough will recognize that as well. Okay, at the same time, though, law firms need to be fiscally responsible and follow the guidance that's out there, okay? Let's say an attorney gets another job offer, and it's way above and beyond the 20 to 33% of the revenue they actually generate, and it's a situation where you'd love to keep them, so you're getting sentimental. You'd hate to see them go, and the question is, do you extend in order to keep them, or do you just let them depart? Obviously, this is going to be different for different law firms, but in a general sense, you can't depart from the guidance too often. If you do, in order to keep somebody, even if you really like them and you're really sad that they're leaving, you can really create a payroll nightmare for yourself where your payroll is too high. And if that payroll is too high, you're going to be a law firm owner struggling to make a living yourself, struggling to get paid yourself, and it's going to impact other areas of your law firm. Like, you're not going to be able to market as you should, or have the space that you want to have, or maybe the health insurance that you want to provide. So most times, look, if somebody's getting some offer and it's way above the 22 to 33% of what they bring in, then you're probably best to let them go and then hire somebody else. Okay, I know it's a kind of a tough medicine for some people to take, but that's really the truth. You don't want to get yourself in financial trouble. And again, even when you're considering the 20 to 33% of what that attorney generates, again, from my vantage point, if the lawyer is bringing in a lot of the business themselves, like through a book of business and through referrals, then that 20 to 33% is a lot more valuable. But if that lawyer is bringing almost no business in, and all the business and all the money they're generating is off marketing you run, then I think it's even more compelling to let them go, because it's not a situation where that lawyer is bringing in the cases themselves, right? You could plug in another lawyer, pay them a reasonable salary that's going to work within your budget, and your firm will just move forward, all right? In any case, that's the topic today. The topic is parameters for attorney salaries. I thought it was an interesting topic. It's one I wanted to cover today. As a follow-up to the episode today, go on over to lawfirmpracticemanagementadvice.com and read this article for more information. But thanks for tuning in today. Stay tuned to our next episode coming up on Law Firm Practice Management Advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Practice Management Advice Podcast with Kirk Stange. Kirk Stange is the president and founding partner of Stange Law Firm, a multi-state divorce and family law practice. For more insight on similar law firm management topics, visit his practice management advice blog at lawfirmpracticemanagementadvice.com.